So often we are confronted by references to patriarchy or matriarchy, a duality that appears prevalent as old as time itself, when humanity first became aware of their surroundings. Often the supposition is that patriarchy was always dominant as a rule. Of course, others will say matriarchies dominated the earliest peoples and how they organized their societies at first. But who is correct? And what does the archaeological evidence have to contribute to that conversation? This question from ancient times has divided scholars as well as others for decades. One example being the controversial Gimbutas and her views. For to answer this question is to reveal a deeper sense of who we are and how we relate to one another, even today. Now, here we go. I'm hoping that when you leave this lecture with this evidence, as opposed to lots of assumptions, that maybe you can understand more about sex and gender in the past, and yes, even to the present as well. Now, let's start out with the Paleolithic Age. Paleolithic Age roughly started around 2.6 million years ago with the beginning of the use of stone tools and ended roughly around 10,000 BCE with the advent of agriculture. Of course, these societies were mainly hunting, gathering, and nature. But how men and women interact with one another, that's a good question. Were the men in charge and the women maybe in charge, or neither? So before we jump into this, I want to pose this question. How has studying how the sexes interact with current hunting and gathering societies contribute to understanding how ancient hunting and gathering societies interacted in the past? Yes, we're going to take the anthropological point of view right from the beginning. So let's jump into it. Hunting gathering societies still, believe it or not, they do continue to exist. And many anthropologists have examined the relationship between the sexes within these contexts in order to understand how they may have related to one another in the distant past. After much comparative work, rather than spear-wielding savages, many anthropologists have determined that the earliest human societies must have been founded with a more, how do I say this, enlightened, egalitarian ideals and principles. You're thinking, well, that seems too idealistic. Well, otherwise, they would not have evolved in the successful way that they did, in a sense, outsmarting their primate competition. Many studies have demonstrated that within contemporary hunting gathering tribes, men and women tend to have, believe it or not, equal amount of influence on where their group settles and even whom they live with, without reverting to either a patriarchal or a matriarchal system for the most part. I mean, there are exceptions, but even the indigenous peoples of the Americas, much of that culture, believe it or not, was egalitarian. Okay, so because of these findings, the idea that sexual equality is a recent invention, it's a newcomer to the evolution of humanity, is, I will just say, absolutely, completely ridiculous. An egalitarian rather than a patriarchal system, believe it or not, was the norm early on. Now, a certain Mark Dibble, he's a leading anthropologist and he's the director of the study at the University College in London. He has examined modern hunting gathering societies, and he realized that it reflected these more ancient revelations. He states, quote, he says, there is still this wider perception that hunting gatherers are more macho or male dominated. We'd argued it was only with the emergence of agriculture, when people could start to accumulate resources, that's when the inequality emerged. So he's saying, no, no, no. He says it was with the emergence of agriculture. That's when we start seeing patriarchal ideas. But before that time, before before that, their accumulation of resources. This was not the story. Dibble, he continues, states that the latest findings suggest that equality between the sexes became a survival advantage that played an important role in shaping human society and evolution. He says that sexual equality is one of an important sweep of changes to social organization, including things like pair bonding or our big social brains or language that distinguishes humans. He says it's an important idea to stress. Now, according to the Science Journal, while people in hunting gathering societies show strong preferences for living with family members, in practice, the groups they live in tend to comprise few closely related individuals. In fact, what happens is this. There have been studies on hunting gathering societies from the Congo region to the Philippines that included kinship relations, movement between camps, and residence patterns. This is done through so many interviews. In these cases, it turned out that people tend to live in groups of around 20 individuals, as we know what happened in prehistory, and they move every 10 days, and they subsist on hunting game, fish, and gathering fruit, as well as vegetables and honey, right? The scientists then constructed a computer model to simulate the process of camp assortment based on these assumptions. And what did they discover? What did they discover? Well, you'll like this. When only one sex had influence over the process, as typical in the case of a male-dominated pastoral society, when only the guys are in charge, basically, there happen to be tight hubs of related individuals that emerged. However, the average number of related individuals is predicated to be much lower when men and women have equal status. So what happened is this: when only men have influence over who they are living with, the core of any community happens to be a dense network of closely related men with spouses on the periphery. Now, if men and women decide together as a group, you don't get groups of 4 or 5 brothers living together, a bunch of guys, you know. What happens instead is you have the result an egalitarian society, as revealed by observing of these hunting and gathering groups today. Men do not simply focus, in this case, on hanging out with other men, but with women too. And why that's important is because it creates more, how do I say this, procreative activities, right? They're not hanging around the dudes anymore. They're mixing with the women and things are happening. That's right. Procreation. And as a result of that, that helps the survival of the group. And so what happens is that sexual equality may have proved an evolutionary advantage for early human societies, as it would have fostered wider ranging social networks and closer cooperation between unrelated individuals. Also, what they discovered is that Dibble said that egalitarianism may even have been one of the important factors that distinguished our ancestors from their primate cousins, you know, chimpanzees. Did you guys know that chimpanzees live in a very quite aggressive male-dominated society? They have clear hierarchies. As a result, they just don't see enough adults in their lifetime for anything to advance. But when we take a look in humans, it's different. It turns out that these hunting gathering societies today that we observe, women are involved in hunting and honey collecting. And while there is still a division of labor, overall men and women contribute a similar number of calories to the camp. In fact, we see that also it appears that men often took care of the children. Why that's important, as Lee T. Gittel argued, is that this, of course, means that women could have more children as the men are taking care of the kids. So by splitting the rearing, a women could direct more energy to bearing, allowing them to give more births more often. Certain John Tooby, another anthropologist in biology specifically, says that two active involved parents instead of one meant children could remain dependent longer and spend more time developing their brains. I mean, it makes a lot of sense. So, but also they discovered something else. From looking at anthropology, we know that it appears early on that women traveled further and sought out sexual partners further out than the men. So if everyone stayed in those little prehistoric caves, says John Tooby, uh, and mated with the folks they knew, I got to say that he says that some scary inbreeding would result. Someone had to venture into the great unknown to find fresh dating stock, and it looks like it happened to be the females. How do we figure that out? Scientists, what they did is they collected teeth from two species of our ancestors who lived at different times in South Africa. And by using laser ablation to measure strontium isotope ratios, figured out that what food those teeth had chewed, and it turned out that well, it resulted that the men stayed in a place where they're at, while women apparently sallied forth and went out, according to these studies. Uh, it's the reality. So egalitarian societies worked for us as a species in an evolutionary sense. The very beginning, we were equal. It's everybody. It's trying to survive. Have you ever seen the show Survivor? It turns out when things are tough, gender goes out, and it's just everybody working together collectively for a better situation. And let's take a look though at this first image here. So this is the stereotype, and we realize that the stereotype does not completely hold true. Of course, yes, men did much of the hunting. We'll talk about that. But sometimes the women did too. Yes, women oftentimes did the gathering, but so did men too. And so it was a collective effort. But let's go to the next image. When it comes to women going further out, they had to explain this. They had to explain why are they going away, and they come back with child. Why are they pregnant? And so all these mythologies grow, that they went out and they couldn't fathom the idea that they went outside the tribe in an intimate sense. It had to be something mystical. It had to be something magical. And so when it happens, for example, many of the groups in East Africa had this idea that there were these forest dwellers that they interacted with. In the Southwest, in the indigenous areas of the Americas, like the Navajo, they interacted with those known as the Mirage people, as you see right here. These mystical, magical people that enable to give us some genetic diversity. So we don't look strange or like the Spanish royal family. So the point of the matter is, you're right, things will happen, right? Unhealthy characteristics. And this is how you get it out. Does that make sense? You guys are following me here. Is this helpful? Good, good, good. So I want you to understand that. Let's move to, you put that one down. Thank you so much. Okay. So what's going to happen? Give me a few seconds here because I want to keep track of whatever pictures I happen to be showing here. Okay, let's go to the next movement so basically this. Many scholars have divided the Paleolithic age between 2.6 million years ago to around 10,000 BCE into four categories based upon the kinds of pieces of artwork that they produced, which reveals the gradual mental development of humans from more simple to more complex in cognitive ability. This is called the four evolutions of cognitive model, as developed by Robert Bittenark of the Archaeological Berichten Group of the Netherlands and James Harold, the founder and chair of the Prehistoric Religions Consultation Unit. So the first age that we look at is known as the mimetic modeling of the world. Let's go to the first image, the mimetic modeling of the world. And this is it. So the mimetic basically is, this stage is between 2.6 BCE to about 1.6 million BCE. So it's a kind of period of time. Here, art appears to be very imitative, duplicating the natural world around them without much variation. The best way to say it is what it is, without too much going on. Let's go to the next one. The next image, yeah. The next period of time is the conceptual meaning modeling. That's a little overlap between 1.9 million to 500,000 BCE. And what happens here is objects appear to have concepts in mind, styles that are full of intent, with ideas or symbols connected directly to the artifacts. Something more is going on than simply making a tool to perform some kind of task. For the embellishments reveal other concepts other than just purely functional ones. You can see right here, there's a sense of aesthetics. In some cases, it's quite beautiful. You also have the development of various hand axes known as bifaces, and there's conceptions that sometimes appear in them, in these three-dimensional hand axes that happen. So this is an example of that. And then, of course, we move, you can move that down. Thank you so much. Then we move, of course, from there. So we go from basically copying what we see. That shows our minds are not as developed yet, right? We're just like kids, like babies, right? We're very imitative, you know? You make a smile and the baby goes, aha, you know, and smiles back, you know? There's this mirror effect. And this is what happens with humanity. So we're thinking maybe the mind is not ready yet for bigger things. But just like a child in child development, we move from there to concepts. You're able to understand ideas. Well, the next step after that is a move from there to abstract thought, right? Abstract. So the third state between 500,000 to 30,000 BCE is that this idea is that more than simply creating objects with concepts in mind, the objects themselves are changeable in response to the importance of the idea, to the point of becoming very abstract as mere representations. In this era, landscape itself is altered to represent these abstract concepts, where we find stone circles and geoglyphs. Symbols appear that could represent perhaps maybe mother goddesses or something that's feminine in context related to animals. So things are happening. Things are happening quickly. You know, you see a triangular shape. Does that represent the pubic region for a female? You'll see a shape that seems conical. Is that representing the phallus? We're not completely sure, but we're guessing, right? And then let's get to the next image. So what happens here after this point, according to most scholars, the earliest known intentional human burials that appear to have religious significance were discovered in the skull cave at Kafsa in Israel, and dates around 90,000 BCE. That's pretty early. And interestingly enough, the skeletal remains, let's go to the next image, the skeletal remains were stained with red ochre paint, surrounded by grave goods, with one of the skeletons, holding a mandible from a wild boar. And so you're having now, what will happen in this case is that the body, so these individuals, they died and they left them to be pecked away, their skin, by the birds, because we find bird peck marks on it. After clearing the skin, then they intentionally paint them red with red ochre paint. What's going to happen now is that this symbolizes something. But the question is, what does red ochre paint symbolize? And that's That's always a big question, and we're not completely sure. Let's put down the picture for now. So red ochre paint is an important symbol. Red obviously can be tied to blood, especially within a burial context, and so could represent life or the life force that is in blood, and perhaps even its vital energies. Covering or sprinkling the bones with red ochre could indicate that life's energies are being brought back, perhaps, to the bones. As a result, some scholars believe the red represented a rebirth. Ah, a way to bring these bones back to life, in a sense, perhaps as protective ancestors. If there is the idea of continuity in any way of the deceased, this would mean that there is part of the individual that goes on. And if that is so, it could indicate a belief in a non-tangible life force, a primitive soul and connection that may be already in place. Other scholars believe that the red ochre represents these energies of life that connects to the earth, and you're bringing it back to the earth, to the soil. In this context, the red is connected to the earth and perhaps associated with fertility magic and perhaps a feminine force of some kind. In this sense, the red is not to give life back to the bones per se, but to the soil itself. Of course, the Great Mother or other goddesses during this time were associated with the earth and fertility. We'll talk about that more. And so these figurines are often smeared with red ochre paint as well. In fact, it begins what I like to call a red ochre paint fad, where red ochre paint is depicted as everywhere, constantly, and so it's not just this instance in the skull cave. This becomes a regular occurrence that we find in the material culture. Okay, so we had the mimetic phase, monkey see, monkey do. Maybe I shouldn't use that analogy, but the idea is imitative. The next phase, of course, is conceptual. We're getting concepts in mind. The next stage is obviously abstract. You have symbols. So what's next? The next step is the mythic linguistic stage between 40,000 to 10,000 BC. And what happens at this point is that those symbols are starting to form sequences. They're starting to form a story. A narrative is coming about. This is the beginning, of course, the rudiments of possibly language. It is within this context that we see one of our first prominent images, and let's take a look at it. Let's take a her. So what happens is, I know it's a little small, but there it is. It's actually very small. If you look at how big it is according to centimeters, right? Very small. And so what happens is evidence for religious beliefs also become more complex during the late Paleolithic. During this period, that which are called Venus figurines begin to appear throughout Eurasia, with 144 such figurines known from that period, not later on. There's a lot more later on, which are virtually all of modest size, between 3 centimeters and 4 centimeters or more in height. Most of them have small heads, wide hips, and legs that taper to a point. Various figurines exaggerate the abdomen, the hips, the breasts, the thighs, the vulva, although many do not. And the concentration in popular accounts on those that do reflect modern preoccupations rather than the range of actual artifacts. People have those questions too. We don't know. In contrast, the arms and feet are often absent, and the head usually is faceless. But this, what we're looking at right here, is called the Venus of Hohlfels. So once again, for the sake of clarity, let's focus on some examples and let's dive in deep. This Venus of Hohlfels, also known as the Venus of Schlecklingen, was discovered, guess where? Near Schlecklingen, Germany in 2008, and dates between 35,000 to 40,000 years ago. This female figure is considered the oldest undisputed example of a human figurative prehistoric art yet discovered. And it could fit comfortably in one's fist This one happened to be broken in fragments, of which 6 have been recovered, with the left breast, with the left arm and shoulder still missing. As are common with these Paleolithic Venus types, the breasts are very exaggerated, as well as the vulva, with her head missing. In the place of the missing head, there happens to be a perforated protrusion, which may have allowed it to be worn as an amulet. The deeply incised horizontal lines possibly represent clothing or straps, and they're cut over the bulging abdomen. But what does the Venus of Hohlefels represent? The context of the find does not give any clues to what its purpose was. The discovery of the figurine was made beneath 3 feet of red-brown sediment in the floor of the Hohlefels cave. And while other Paleolithic sculptures out of ivory were found there, about the Swabian region of southern Germany, there is no direct context that can interpret it from the surrounding material culture. So it's hard to figure it out. So let's see my mug for a second. So let's go into the controversy. So Nicholas Canard, who discovered the piece, calls the Swabian region of southern Germany, where he discovered the image, a art gallery of early modern human art and the possible birthplace of true sculpture in the European, maybe global artistic tradition. So it's believed to be here, which is interesting because it happens to be a female figurine. But as for the piece itself, he states, this figure, now this is him, this is not me, okay? He said, this figure is about sex and reproduction. It is an extremely powerful depiction of the essence of being female, unquote. Conrad's interpretation are most of the, as are most of the interpretations of Venus objects from the Paleolithic era, are based upon the image itself and not the surrounding context, because not enough has survived to tell us more. There is no pedestal that survives that places this object into a prominent position or any other positional indicators that this was revered in any manner. It was found beneath the mud. There are no surviving offerings before it or with it that would tell the observer that this object was sacred. The assumption of reproduction is based upon the exaggeration of the belly and breasts and the possible de-emphasizing of the other features. To say it is a goddess is problematic. We just don't have enough context one way or the other. It may be a goddess. It may not be a goddess. We have to ask ourselves, how much are we reading into the evidence from a time we barely know anything about? Some have said that later objects that are similar to this one, which had a context revealing some kind of heightened esteem and were most likely goddesses, can be read back to these earlier objects and so say that they are goddesses. So in a sense, this is the beginning of a precedent of artistic traditions that within a later context is understood to be a goddess. And then you read that backwards. But the problem is that any object can be interpreted in multiple ways. So we got to be very careful. People like Paul Mellers at Cambridge University often challenges such assumptions. While I do believe Dr. Mellers' assertions are rather crass, I will cite it as an example of how far many scholars are willing to go to debunk the fertility interpretation. Miller states that by modern standards, he says, the figurine could be seen as bordering on the pornographic. Miller adds that one can avoid being struck by its very sexually explicit depiction of a woman. The breasts really jump at you. I assume it was a guy who carved it, perhaps representing his girlfriend. A Paleolithic playboy? We just don't know how it was used at this point, but the object's size meant it fit very well in someone's hand. Before I go on, I just want to pause for a moment, and I want to tell you that here is the problem, is that so many of those in these circles are still very steeped in patriarchal considerations and ideas, and they can't help, they should help the objectification, and that goes into their scholarship. This is the old guard of anthropology, a guard that I believe needs to set away and step aside for those who are younger and more willing to have more agile and more open minds to these interpretations. That just because something looks sexual does not immediately mean it's pornographic or it's a toy. By the way, I'm going to bring this up because we're here. And she'll love that I mentioned her. Tammy Snyder, who is one of the lead archaeologists at Claremont Graduate University, and she excavated Telefar in Israel, and she's very well known. She was head of ASOR for many years. She is very angry because of these kinds of responses to the material culture in general. And she says that many archaeologists, especially in the Middle East where she works, will see these objects and they'll see them in an objectification. They'll see it through this lens that these are just toys, these are playthings, these are pornographic, and they should be taken seriously. And many of these, I'll be very careful, many of these scholars have a religious perspective that's very conservative, where they feel already this idea that women should are not equal to themselves, and she had to struggle with this as a good archaeologist working in the Middle East. This happens all the time. So I want to tell you, this is the biggest problem. It is of examining these materials is because of our current bias. Okay, so it is. No, so what happens now? Here we go. So let's go to another object. When it comes to figurative art in general, only the lion-headed and zoomorphic Lovenmensch figurine was made earlier than the Venus of Hohlfels, which dates to around 40,000 BCE and is also sculpted out of ivory. This figure has a human body and a lion head, and scholars are uncertain if the body is that of a male or a female. The lion head does not have a mane, which of course would seem to be a female lion, but European lions often did lack a mane. So at this point, it's best to say the gender is undetermined. Although ivory pieces from this period are often considered as being used for hunting magic, the fanciful Lovenmensch figurine does not correlate with anything anyone would have hunted, but appears to be completely imaginative. Some have said that this may be a representation of a hallucination from a tribal shaman. Of course, as we know from what prehistoric people literally leave behind, they did not eat lions or bears, but mostly reindeer, bison, horse meat, according to the bones that the archaeologists have found. And obviously, the female figurines do not correspond to hunting magic, at least in the tracking, killing, and feasting sense. At least we hope. Okay, so right, okay, so were all the Paleolithic Venus figurines then these Rubenesque Venus types? No. So let's go to the next image. No, while that is while we're often taught that these Paleolithic figurines come in all shapes and sizes, and so are not relegated to simply to the more voluptuous types, although the latter type was very popular. Exceptions, of course, would be the Venus of Galgenberg and the Venus Petrovice. Look at this one. This is the Venus Galgenberg. It dates from around 30,000 years ago. It was discovered in 1988. Unlike the Venus of Hohlfels and the Lovenmensch figurine, rather than ivory, she was carved out of green serpentine rock. Isn't this a beautiful piece? In description, the upper body is turned to the side in a dancing position. It has a three-dimensional front, flat back, believed to have a cultic, possibly a religious significance. One breast juts out to the left, the other faces frontward. The vulva is clearly indicated. The left arm is raised, and the right hand rests on the thigh, posed as though in a ritual or dance position. The stone material is from the immediate vicinity of where the figurine was made, and the waste material provides proof that the figurine was made actually in that same area. The Venus Galgenberg is more slender than most of the Venus types, and is beyond dispute that this figurine is intended to be a portrayal of something that is moving. Perhaps it is dancing. So again, what does this represent? Yeah, it's dancing, possibly, or it's moving, but what does it mean? We don't have the context. I wish we did. Does that make sense, right? But it does seem to be connected to some sort of movement. Perhaps it's ritual, perhaps it's religious. Let's go to the next image. Then we have the Venus of Dolny Vitusi, discovered in 1925 in the Moravian Basin. It was made of clay fired at a relatively low temperature and dates between 29,000 to 25,000 BCE. This Venus is very much, in a sense, Rubenesque, round belly and very wide hips. Okay, so we're getting somewhere here, and you can see right away that there seems to be a connection here. You're getting this point already of voluptuousness and aspects related to pregnancy. Do you see this yet? Right, we're starting to get there. We're going to see more images. Don't worry. I mean, she could be simply larger. That's very possible. But many scholars will say that, will indicate that this possibly has to do with fertility. However, we can play the game. We can also say that what's happening here is, remember, we have their campsites. It turns out that Paleolithic humanity, they go from site to site to site. And I got to tell you, they're not eating that much. They're not having that much food. So let's do some deduction here. Okay. They're not having much food, and they're having representations that are female that are larger. What do you think that could represent? Many anthropologists say, well, it represents that they want something. They want a what? They want fertility. They also want food. So this could also be connected to the need to fill the tummy, to not be starving like oftentimes happened. So no matter what it is, here we go, drum roll, please. It's abundance. Abundance tied to the female figure. Whether we read in that this has to do with fertility and childbirth, whether we say, well, maybe it has to do with having more food, this already scholars are saying this does represent the idea of abundance in some way, and it is believed by many to say that well, this then is they're having this image because this is what they want to attract. They want to attract this idea of fertility, of abundance. They need it. Is that helpful? Right? You're seeing these connections. Okay, let's go. Let's go to the next image. This is the Venus of Willendorf. This is the one that we always see constantly. And I gotta tell you, they always show this one. Now that we have a context, and I could show you more, this is just one of so many. Does that make sense? This is the one that's popular, but why is it so different? Well, it dates between 28,000 to 25,000 BCE. Again, it's very abstract. It's idealized vision of a woman. There's a sense of exaggeration here, right? Things are pronounced. Her face is very de-emphasized. Do we not see this in most of the figurines? The face is de-emphasized, having no features with the exception of a kind of headdress or coil braided hair, which I do find is very interesting. Because of the emphasis of the physical features associated with fertility, most scholars today see this as a fertility figure. Okay, and I can see that once again, but I'm going to stay with my thesis that I also believe it can also represent the notion of abundance. That's something that you're wanting much of something. And I kind of wonder, how come the faces are so de-emphasized in some of these images? There's so many more that I'm not showing you. Why are they not showing the faces? They just can't make a face, right? And the idea is we don't want to distract from the function of this, which is the body. right? We also don't want to have some kind of mirror image of ourselves, right? At this time, this will change. Don't worry. But at this time, we want to focus in on the fact that this connects to fertility, to life. Okay, thank you. Let's go to the next image. There we go. This is the, I don't know why this was like, this one is the Venus of Lespuig. It discovered in the Pyrenees in 1922. It dates to around the same time as the Venus of Willendorf, from between 26,000 to 24,000 years ago. It is carved out of ivory. Of all the Venus figurines, this one appears to display the most exaggerated female secondary characteristics. As you can see here, this figurine displays the earliest representation found of spun thread. So we know now that they're spinning clothing, right? 26,000 years ago, they are spinning, and we're seeing the representation right here. Of course, who is doing the spinning? Is it women? Is it men? Is it both collectively? I believe it will be both collectively. These are egalitarian societies. So that's my perspective. This figurine also shows a skirt. Do you see the skirt hanging from below the hips, right? Made of twisted fibers, frayed at the end. I don't know. I find this figurine so exciting. Now, Margherita Musi from the University of Rome noted that this Venus actually portrays two women, one of them upside down. The skirt is also the hair of the upside down woman. Such portrayals were common with Ice Age art, and especially the female figurines. But the question is, what in the world does this mean? And we don't know. But it is something that's related to fertility. I know we want definitive answers. We'll get there eventually. Let's get to the next one. This is the Venus Petrikovus, 23,000 BC. Was discovered in old Czechoslovakia at that time, Czech Republic, in 1953. It was found lying beneath a mammoth molar within a settlement of mammoth hunters. The statue is basically a headless torso of a woman carved from iron ore. It's very unique. The absence of the head appears to be the author's intention again. Also, unlike other prehistoric Venus figurines, it shows a slender young woman or a girl with small breasts. Yes, possible. But once again, we're back to no head. Maybe it's the idea that if this does represent, I'll just venture, if this does represent fertility, and fertility is connected to the earth, then you cannot depict in imagery at this time this particular goddess. Okay, so we're going to go there. I'm going to bring out some theoreticals in a few moments, but I want to give you some more materials, and then I'm going to say something. Okay, but let's go over a few of these here. Let's go over the next one. Also, there have been 30 of these Venus figurines found in Siberia. The Malata figurines. We have, of course, a few images of them. Most of these statuettes show stylized clothes, and unlike many of the other Venus figurines, this one is different. These depict a face. There we go. We got a face. At first glance, what is obvious is that the Malta, not to be confused with Malta, Venus figurines are of two types: full-figured women with exaggerated forms, and women with thin and delicate form. Some of the figurines are nude, while others have etchings that seem to indicate fur or clothing. Most of the figurines were tapered at the bottom, and it is believed, let's go to the next image, it believed that this was done so they could be stuck in the ground or placed upright in some ways. Placed upright, they could have symbolized the spirits of the dead, akin to spirit dolls used nearly worldwide, including, of course, the contemporary people of Siberia to this day. So these are all possibilities. So in summary, it appears that many of the Paleolithic Venus images do not necessarily have exaggerated breasts, bellies, and hips, indicating that a monolithic interpretive grid is problematic for all of them. They appear to be used for diverse purposes. We may not be exactly certain what they were all for, but it appears a great possibility that they were intended for many things. So let's see my mug again, and I'm going to say a few things. So what in the world is going on? Okay, so from here now, the anthropologist and archaeologist has to join the religious scholar and the historian in this conversation. And so this is the reality. The reality is that I talked about a precedent. Later on, historically and from religious scholars, it is still possible to read back in time a certain extent, especially when some of these mythologies come from this earlier time. And it turns out, we know for a fact, as soon as we get to the time of the written record, we know for a fact that the earth is associated with women, female. Absolutely. We know that. It's hard to get around that. That is, the majority of the cultures out there, they see the earth as a mother. This happens all throughout the world. Okay, so this is something. So we can all automatically now and go, well, why would they think? Here we go. Why would they think such a thing? Okay, so here we go. They would think such a thing for the following reasons. You see, what happens is that the earth, let's say it moves, right? And the earth moves forward. And when it moves forward, of course, it gets warmer, right? So you have, of course, you have the summer solstice, right? And you notice that the seasons change, right? The seasons change, right? It's hotter. Then of course, in the autumn, obviously, you have this equinox, and then for the northern hemisphere, it goes the other way, right? And what happens from there? You know, oh, you got the summer, sorry, you have the winter, the winter solstice. This is making sense. And then you have the spring equinox. So it changes through time. Well, what happens is this, is the fact that when these seasons change, there are periods of growth, death, renewal, and these cycles continue on, going back and forth in this special kind of rhythm, okay? The special kind of rhythm. And they realize that the earth itself gives life, that the earth itself gives life. When they take a look at the dude, they took a look at the guy, he doesn't give life, or he's not perceived as giving life. Life doesn't come out of him, right? When they observe the woman, they see that life comes out of her. You know, something magical happens. The story goes, it goes as follows, is that one day, the lady suddenly gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And all of a sudden, she has a baby. And the guy's super excited. He says, oh, wow. you know, he looks just like my best friend. No clue. So the idea is they thought that the woman was great magic, that this is magical, that even though perhaps men had something to do with it, it wasn't fully understood. It's believed that she was magical because she was able to give birth. Well, what will happen is then they'll see the earth and they'll realize it's not the male who's giving birth. It is, right? It is the female that's giving birth. So therefore, they will equate the earth as a female. So in all these mythologies, you're going to have this concept of Mother Earth. For even the Greeks and the Romans, right? The early Hindu stories. Does that make sense? So making this simplistic deduction is not very hard. It's not very difficult. And you can see now where they can take a step and say, well, these female figurines represent the earth. They represent then an earth goddess or female spirit of some kind. We don't know exactly what it means, but we do understand that it's feminine, it connects to abundance, and most likely it connects to earth processes, including, of course, fertility and abundance in food. It's all these things that people want. And what we also know is that after we get to the Neolithic era, after the Paleolithic, they go crazy. These female figurines are everywhere, and more with a discernible context. Is that helpful? Right? Does that help? Okay. So here we go. Very exciting moment. Let's go to the next image. What about evidence from archaeology about women, specifically in religious roles? How far back did this evidence go? The very first evidence we have of a shaman dates to 30,000 to 26,000 BCE and was discovered in what is today the Czech Republic. And this shaman happens to be female. It was discovered in Dolny. This overtly human female skeleton reveals that she was 40 years or a little older when she died, an unusually old age for that era. She was ritualistically placed, as you can see, beneath a pair of mammoth scalpeli, with one leaning against the other in a very articulate manner and in a way that was unique from the other burials around it. The left side of her skull was disfigured. What is interesting is that the skull is disfigured in the same manner as a carved ivory figure discovered near the huts, with this figurine also having the left side of its face distorted. This indicates that the figure was an intentional depiction of this specific person. Let's take a look at what she looked like, a reconstruction based on her skull. So let's see her. There she is. So that's what she looked like. And of course, let's take a look at the figurine that was discovered next to her body. There it is. You see it? Wow, right? And you see even the distortion. The bones and the earth surrounding the body contain traces of red ochre paint, of course. A flint spearhead carefully placed near the skull also indicates certain kinds of power. One of her hands held the body of a fox. This, of course, this is the oldest site not only of ceramic figurines and artistic portraiture, but also evidence of a female shaman. Of course, the various items found with the woman, inclusive of the mammoth scalpeli and the fox, the ceremonial burial in general, and the depiction of her discovered nearby, has made a profound impact on the interpretation of the social hierarchy of the people at the site, as well as indicating an increased lifespan for those inhabitants. Unlike many of the Paleolithic Venus figurines, there's absolutely a surrounding context surviving around this lady, and with very obvious ritual connections to her as the individual, as well as demonstrates that her importance and esteem to the rest of the community. She is a shaman. Okay, you seeing that. Now, there's other burials, though. Let's go to the next image. There's other burials discovered here, reveal equality in burial after death, excuse me. So we're going to see burials where men and women are buried in the same manner, equally, with the same amount of grave goods. We also have discovered here a male image. I think this is a pretty cool one, too. Very stylized as well. This appears to be a young man with a heavy bone structure, thick, long hair reaching past his shoulders, and maybe traces of a beard. I think I see a beard there, right? Originally found in 1891. It was thought as a hoax before, but it does date from about 26,000 before the Common Era, and it is made out of ivory. It's pretty exciting stuff that's going on. So I think it's fascinating that we have the earliest image, earliest shaman happens to be a female. We'll see a lot more of that too. Let's go to the next image. Okay, so what is this? This is another artistic depiction of a male, because we're talking about gender rules, so I got to make sure that men are represented as well. So this is I guess this is a dude, right? Discovered in a small cave named Enlaine. This is in southwestern France. It's called a sorcerer. That is apparently dancing near the light aperture of the cave and has a human face and a beard, but the eyes of an owl, the tail of a horse, and the claws of a lion. dating to around 13,000 BCE. The image is partly carved and partly painted. So it is a combination of those two. So we don't, of course, obviously we don't know exactly what it's for, but it does seem kind of magical, right? Okay, let's go to the next image. All right. So, okay. I love this is a kind of fun kid image here of male and female roles. From the evidence, it appears that during the Paleolithic into the Upper Paleolithic age, with the continuation of a hunting and gathering society, men primarily did do the hunting, while women primarily did the gathering. But there are, of course, exceptions. And archaeologist Brian Hayden from Simon Fraser University notes that that sexual division of labor in which hunter-gatherer males hunt, make war, and engage in other exclusively male activities seem to be predominant, while women concentrate more on gathering and infant care. It is supported by a very large body, he says, of objective observations. This pattern may even imply that the cross-cultural preponderance of hunter-gathering males in public forums and in dealing with non-local groups may be an extension of the division of labor, since in hunter-gathering and most other traditional societies, male are most involved in defense. They travel more extensively, and they are more likely to encounter non-local groups. Yeah, let's take that picture down. I want to make my commentary. There we go. I mean, don't mind this. Like, here's my extra bit. Also, we have to realize this. You would think, okay, so the men are going out, and a large, not all, but large portion of the men will become the hunters, and a large portion of the women will be the gatherers. But this is not an absolute rule. This is based upon evidence. And what does this mean? Why do we have just completely women doing the hunting as well with the men side by side? Well, I want to say, first of all, there is examples of that does exist. In fact, some of that happened, we know for a fact, in the steppes of Russia and in parts of Eastern Europe, which is the origin of some of the Amazon myths. Da, 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 da. Okay, music over. So, but what happens though is that, as I said, women do something pretty magical. They give birth. It's not easy to hunt while pregnant. You can do it. It's absolutely possible, but it's not easy. And unfortunately, the problem is when it comes to food production, and because childbirth is so difficult, where basically for your child to survive getting through, it's going to be chances are, well, 1 out of 4 kids are not going to make it even in that area. So they got to be really careful about that process. That makes sense. So staying in the cave, or it's not really a cave, staying wherever they're at, because we have this idea of caves everywhere. They don't. But staying where you're at is a good idea, especially towards the end of the pregnancy. The other factor is that animals smell blood. I'm sorry, they do. So so if you are a predator and women have this magical time that happens every month, it's just a wonderful time. I know this is sarcasm, I know. When that happens, if you're out, the animal whose prey, who basically is the predator, it will smell the blood. If you've gone camping before, you know what I'm talking about, right? And also those who are the prey, they're going to run. So it does tend to distract. Now, that doesn't mean, remember I told you Amazon, that doesn't mean that women didn't hunt, but there's one other factor I want to bring up. Man, you're not going to like this. Sorry. Women are kind of more important for the continuity of the tribe or the group. I'm sorry, they are. They're going to ensure that it keeps going. Does that make sense? Are you guys following that? They have to be taken care of in that way. So that means so many of the men, we know this once again. Where are we getting this? Are we getting this from just ancient times, guesswork? No, we're actually getting this from egalitarian societies today. This is anthropology 101. This is just how it works. If you study various hunting gathering groups in today's context, the same thing happens. Is this helpful, right? And so what will happen is this. The men will go out, oftentimes, they will hunt. The women who are closer will gather because it is closer. Did you guys know that sometimes hunting these animals didn't take just simply days? Sometimes it took a week or longer. Do you also realize, I just mentioned they run into other groups and other animals, that oftentimes when they come back to camp, there's less of them, right? Yeah, less of them. Yeah, less in numbers because they got killed along the way. And so there's this need for continuity. So I know we think to ourselves, well, the men, they're these leaders. How are you going to be a leader if you're not there? You're gonna call? Hey, I'm out here hunting, trying to get to this mammoth, but I want this order. Does that make sense? You can't be a leader if you're not there. Now, of course, I'm sure they had some male leaders that stayed around, but what will happen is, and you're going to see this in the material culture, it seems that more often than not, the women form a semblance of leadership within that base camp because the men are out there doing their thing. Does that make sense? They will become the leaders. This is why we'll see, we're going to see more of this. Don't worry, I'm ahead of the game. We'll see the material culture. We're going to see a lot more female leaders in the material culture earlier on than you're going to see male leaders. That's going to change, but you're going to see that earlier on. So we're basing this upon the material culture. We're not doing guesswork here, but we're kind of putting it together of why these things are happening. Is this helpful? We could also realize all we have to do is go to the campsites. We can count around how many female bones are in these areas and the lack of, and less men going, well, something's happened to them. Women are there, but the men, there's less of them. What's happening to them? Well, they're getting killed, wounded, starving out there hunting. Is that helpful? So I want to go ahead and give that context so you kind of understand a little bit more about it. Now Hayden talks about, he says, some researchers have questioned the universality of sexual division of labor amongst hunting gatherers, and or try to deny that a clear pattern exists. There is little general doubt that this patterning of gender behavior is the expression of a fundamental principle of organization of hunting gathering societies and even more complex traditions. But what will happen is he's making it very clear that yes, there are divisions of labor, but it has nothing to do with patriarchy. It has nothing to do with men are over women or women are over men. It's a partnership, but they are doing different roles, but they're doing so equally. It's just about surviving. It's about getting through the next winter. Because you're a dude, you're the ones in charge. They're not thinking that way at all. If anything, because of this connection to this power of the female figure, which we see represented in the artwork, if anything, women have a heightened role that we see earlier on in the material culture. Okay, so there you have it. So let's go to the next image. That's right. Let's go to the cave paintings discovered at Lascaux in southwestern France, which are associated with the Upper Paleolithic age and date sometime between 15,000 to 13,000 BCE. It was discovered by 4 curious teenagers in 1940, along with their dog by the name of Robot. Kind of cute. These caves display very realistic images of animals, along with abstract geometric designs and painted dots correlating exactly with various constellations, revealing the importance of the night sky. While 900 animals have been identified, 605 are exactly known, including 364 horses, 90 stags, representations of cattle and bison, about 5% of the images, 7 felines, a single bear, a rhinoceros, bird, and 1 human. Let's go to the next image. Let's look at the, so that's the next image here. That's the one human. Apparently, we don't have to go any further. He looks like he's male. So there you have it. So let's go to the next one. Oddly enough, there are no images of reindeer, even though we know through all the bones discovered at their campsites that happen to be their main food source. The most outstanding animal representations in the cave happen to be bulls, quite a bit of that. So when people used to say that this has to do with magic, where you capture the animal's essence and you paint with red ochre paint, and then you go down and you hunt that animal, the reality is that these are animals that they're not hunting. They're not hunting these animals. So it can't be that. So these animals must represent something else, right? Right? Must represent something else. So a few scholars suggest that these paintings are merely for aesthetic purposes, ignoring the related iconography and other symbols about the animals. And remember that these caves were very inaccessible during the Upper Paleolithic age. It's not the kind of place to leisurely take in some nice paintings. The fact that it took so much effort to even get there suggests the importance of the site in a ritualistic sense, a sort of localized pilgrimage, perhaps. Some scholars theorize the caves were intended to be used in the context of hunting, but of course, I just shot that one down. That's right. But we do have hundreds of them. But one other part is that the assumption is that men painted these images. Huh. So they left their handprints behind. Yeah, look at these nice male hands. That's called sarcasm. Let's go to the next image, if that's not convincing you. Who painted these images? Huh. I wonder who. Let's take a next image. That's kind of small, but you get the idea. So, yeah, thank you for showing that. So, tell me, what image is that? So hundreds of these hands are stenciled in of people, their hands. 75% of these hands are female hands. Experts can identify the gender of a hand's owner relatively reliably based upon its proportions. Men's ring fingers tend to be longer than their index fingers, while in women, the two fingers tend to be the same length. In most of the Paleolithic era stencils found in France and in Spain, the ring and index fingers are the same length. It is women most who are making these images. They're artistic. Once again, not all women have that length, but a large portion of them do. Now, everybody's looking at their hands, aren't they? As I'm choking. Okay. So some anthropologists argue that female Neanderthals participated in hunting, a dangerous activity in part based on their skeletons displaying sorry, the same fractures male skeletons do. Excuse me, I gotta drink something. Okay, so it turns out the Neanderthal female skeletons had the same injuries as the male skeletons, and perhaps they were more involved in hunting. It's a possibility. We also began to find evidence for two religious views that become more defined and opposing as the era progresses, that of cults associated with the hunter warrior, often found within the context of caves, and those surrounding that of a female image that are viewed later on as mother goddesses, typically connected with domestic settings and household shrines. This starts to be happening. So let's go on to Maharaji Gimbutas. So let's show Gimbutas right here. So Gimbutas has much to say about the role of sexes, as evident from archaeology from the Paleolithic and Neolithic eras. She lived from 1921 to 1994. She was a professor of European archaeology and Indo-European studies at UCLA from 1963 to 89. She deeply believed in the existence of a prehistoric Europe, of a widespread culture centered on the goddess as a life giver and a sustainer, as well as a death wielder. As a renowned archaeologist, directing major excavations at Neolithic sites in southeastern Europe, she did this between 1967 and 1980. Um, she seemed to be an authority on this topic, and she found cross-cultural and cross-chronological symbolic parallels when it comes to these figurines. While conducting Indo-European excavations, let's go to the next image. Gimbutas came across tiny figurines, usually female, from an era predating the Indo-Europeans. She states, I always questioned what they were and why there was no explanation of them. Since the figurines often possessed exaggerated buttocks, breasts, and vulvas, some archaeologists dismissed them as a kind of prehistoric pornography, unquote. But Gimbutas was unconvinced. She tracked down the figurines in museums and led excavations in Greece and Yugoslavia, where she uncovered 500 more of them. Ernestine Elster, a director of publications at UCLA's Institute of Archaeology, remembers traveling in Europe with Gimbutas during this period, amazed by Gimbutas' unending energy. On one leg of the trip, Elster says the pair visited small museums in Hungary, where the figurines were often stashed away. I soon discovered that while she was photographing the object, she says, my job was to talk to the museum director so that he wouldn't get bored. She continues, my German wasn't very good, but if the director spoke in German, I could figure out when it was time for me to say, mein Gott, or sehr gut. That's how we got through. By the way, I got to tell you, I've done exactly the same thing before. I traveled throughout Europe and did research. And the one person I was with, what happened was we took turns. We distracted the person in charge, and the other person took pictures secretly, or vice versa. That's just the reality. Anyway, Gimbutas says that she spent most of a decade studying the figurines. Then, trusting her intuition to point the way, she concluded that the figurines were representations of goddesses whose exaggerated sexual organs had no erotic significance, but rather reflected links to reproduction and nature. Go to the next image. After gathering her research, Gimbutas believed the central and venerated position of women in the unconscious of early European people seemed probable. This order of things changed with the incursion by Kurgan groups who arrived between 4,300 BCE to 2,800 BCE. And the European world moved, what she says, from a matrilinear society to a patrilinear society. Her findings were published. And of course, she talked about these various images or symbols. This is one of them here, according to Gimbutas. That you will see these images that are connected to, for example, the circle represented the womb, and so many circular grave sites represented the womb as well. So she believed this. Okay, let's see my face for a few moments. Of course, she wrote many books, and so Gimbutas' thesis proved to be very popular to female empowerment and neo-pagan groups. Gimbutas didn't identify the diverse and complex Paleolithic and Neolithic female representations she recognized as depicting a single universal great goddess, but also a manifestation of a range of female deities. She saw them as snake goddesses and bee goddesses and bird goddesses and mountain goddesses and mistress of the animals. So she wasn't always trying to focus on a great goddess. She saw these as multiple goddesses oftentimes. At first, then things change. Now, myriads of female figurines were discovered from the Neolithic age. So we're entering the Neolithic age. According to Gimbutas, these figurines were not just images to secure fertility for the vegetative world, to revitalize life for the crops, but were connected to what she called a spiritual feminine force that often represented a shifting kaleidoscope of meaning for those who fashioned and venerated them. Whether these feminine images were anthropomorphic, zoomorphic, or even abstract, Gimbutas viewed them as connected to five basic categories of life. First of all, life-giving images. Second, life-sustaining portrayals. 3, vegetation goddesses. 4, images of death and decay. And finally, representations associated with regeneration. And I can see that. Gimbutas believed that the triangle represented the female pubic region and so constituted a feminine symbol as well. So, as I said, she believed that the circle was connected to feminine ideas. Let's take a look at one that she talked about. So there are other examples. For example, this, the discovery of 21 small female figurines. You see this, seated in a circle, discovered in a Cutini village site in northeastern Romania. Let's take a look at them closer up. This image. Yeah. Well, I could see maybe there's a connection with the circle. And I could see that, yeah, these kind of look like female images to me, right? Right. And you can see, once again, these connections of ideas. So there you have it. So let's take this down and let's go into the other side of you, because I got to play all sides here. All right. So what are the criticisms, however, of Gimbutas, and are they justified or not? Yes, her findings are not without criticism. Anthropologist Bernard Wales, 1934 to 2012, of the University of Pennsylvania, made a comment that most of Gimbutas' peers believed her to be immensely knowledgeable, but not very good at critical analysis, he says. She amasses all the data and then leaps from it to conclusions without intervening argument, unquote. He said that most archaeologists consider her to be eccentric. Dr. Wales also said, most of us tend to say, oh my God, here she goes again, unquote. Ruth Tringheim, a professor of anthropology at the University of California, Berkeley, is an authority on the same time and geographical area, prehistoric Europe, as Dr. Gimbutas, and was upset by many of the assertions, quote, that she demanded. These are serious qualifications. She declared, no other archaeologist I know would express this certainty. As for the idyllic era Gimbutas portrayals before the arrival of the Indo-Europeans, Edgar C. Palom, a leading Indo-European scholar at the University of Texas and co-editor of a volume of essays published in honor of Gimbutas, calls her portrayal of Old Europe a bit of a dream world. Meanwhile, Keith Boll, a UCLA religion history professor and a friend of Gimbutas, says she has a peculiar romantic strand that causes her to, quote, overestimate pre-Indo-European societies. David Anthony has disputed Gimbutas' assertion that there, quote, that there was a widespread, peaceful society prior to the Kurgan incursion, noting that Europe had hill forts and weapons and presumably warfare long before the Kurgan. A standard textbook on European prehistory corroborates this point, stating that warfare existed in Neolithic Europe and that adult males were given preferential treatment and burial rights. This goes on and on. Ian Hunter said that Cambridge University in archaeology basically calls her work extremely important because it provides a coherent and wide-ranging view of the evidence, but he rejects her interpretation of symbols. She looks at squiggles on a pot and says it's a primeval egg or a snake, or she looks at female figurines and says they're mother goddesses. I don't really think there's an awful lot of evidence to support that level of interpretation. So it goes on and on. Brian Hayden, of course, because stylized portrayals of humans can represent a wide diversity of meanings. There could be a wide, diverse of portrayals as well. So how can we say for sure? In fact, it goes on. I'm going to go read it all. There's tons and tons of pages of this that I have. So certainly rocked the boat, didn't she? Right? Even the idea of her assertion of matrilinear descent systems, or even matrilocal residence implies female dominance in traditional societies, is being attacked upon, right? So yeah, but the thing is that there's a lot of disagreement. You ready for my commentary? You know, I'm gonna go here a little bit later on, but I'm gonna say this. What's my opinion on Gimbutas? I mean, so here it is. You know, we'll talk more about it a little bit later, but I want to go through more evidence. But look at this. Okay, so basically, you had this idyllic kind of age, where from her perspective, it seemed to be more matriarchal. You know, at least when it comes to, you know, keeping these family lines together. She seems to say it was more peaceful. She seems to assert that, and that people were living in a period of time of high production, eventually, of various resources. And then along comes the evil Indo-Europeans. Here we come. There they come. The Kurgan peoples. Here comes the Indo-Europeans, and they're completely patriarchal, and they roll on through, and they destroy this idyllic society where women have a heightened place and reverence. Yeah. Okay. So, but here's where I go. It seems to me, if you hadn't read this, and all the comments, is they seem to be asserting, as opposed to matriarchy, and we'll see this, they seem to be asserting almost a patriarchal notion, which, by the way, sorry, you guys, that's simply bad anthropology. Egalitarian. So I'm not going to say it's a matriarchal society. I will stand up and say strongly it was an egalitarian society. Absolutely. And again, it's that old guard needs to go away. It's the old guard that can't handle this. Why would she anger so many people? Because there's enough evidence to say that the old patriarchal stereotypes do not hold, and it bothers them. And so the biggest thing they want to do is they want to shut her up. You know, stop her. She's talking too much. And they will use, unfortunately, stereotypes that are placed upon women on her, which is not right either. They are, can I say this? Mansplaining, right? I know. They're saying they're doing that to her. They talked her down throughout her life. And guess what? Recent evidence has proven much of her ideas as more correct than they thought. Is that helpful? More correct. We're going to, yeah, of course, we're going to go into the evidence. I wouldn't leave you hanging like that, would I? No. Got it? Because everything's shades of gray. So, are there differences between, of course, at this time, what's going to happen is, yes, women and men do hold different positions. It has nothing to do with equality. This matriarchy, patriarchy. This is so modern. It's so Western. It's you know, it's problematic right from its core. Sure, yes, there are differences between males and females that do connect to survival. They do. There are physiological differences between men and women in prehistoric times, of course. It has been established that sex hormones affect levels of aggression and secondary sexual traits, right? We know this. Of course, Hayden talks about this. Fisher, 1990, Parker and Parker, 1979. It has also been established that levels of sex hormones have clear effect on brain development in fetuses. And there are important indications that female hormones have a positive effect on fine motor skills and adverse effect on hunting-related spatial tasks, according to Barnes of 1988 and Kimura 1987 and Wittek and Peterson in 1989. On the other hand, males perform better in gross motor tasks and women perform better in spatial tasks associated with gathering, according to Fisher 1990 and Kimura 1987, as well as Silverman and Eels in 1990. Levy in 1981 has shown that female brains tend to be less asymmetrical than males, while Lacoste-Houghton and Holloway in 1982 have demonstrated 6 differences in the corpus callosum of the brain, arguing that such differences may be related to different visual spatial functions. Durden Smith and De Simone, I'm giving my sources, okay, and Kimura have documented these and other gender differences in the organization of male and female brains, and they suggest that there may be some predisposition to different types of behavior because of this factor. Also see Gibbons in 1991. Different balances of hormones according to gender, as well as differences in brain physiology, may have considerable potential for explaining persistent sexual psychological differences relating to male aggression, competition, dominance, object orientation, spatial analysis, and mathematical dexterity, although I don't buy the mathematical dexterity, just saying that. But Betlow and Stanley says that in 1983, Tiger 1970. Given the strong hormonal relation to sexual activity, it does not even seem unreasonable to suggest that hormones may be responsible for differences in male versus female sexual fantasies, according to Ellis in 1990. So even they still say that male and female eyes differ, with a black spot where light comes into the eye wider on women than men, finding that findings that could turn out to be linked with beauty and attraction. On average, men have pupils 3.5 millimeters wide, while women have pupils 3.8 millimeters wide. While men's eyes are more sensitive to small details and moving objects, women's eyes are more perceptible to color changes. So men and women actually do see things, they say, differently according to the biology of sex differences in the course. So then it would, obviously, they would say that it would make men better hunters and women better gatherers in prehistoric times. That's what they say. Furthermore, women have more sensitive noses than men and can discriminate categories of odors better than males. Again, Bobrov and colleagues record this in the Journal of Biological Sexual Differences. But then again, of course, the question is, do we have their actual bodies here? Do we have their actual physical forms here? So we have their skeletons. So we can't make huge generalizations, but I still have to note them. Sorry, I have to note them. And these are some of the arguments that anthropologists will say. But they say that. So this is some of the supportive evidence. I'm just giving you the information, right? So what happens now? Well, let's go back to my belief. I believe, in the perception sense, is I believe that male and female are a little bit more similar than different. I'm just saying, but they still are different enough. I can see this, different enough to have different roles. And we do know this because this appears in the material culture, right? This is something that we do see, that we can test from a scientific perspective, that we can date. But we can also see that early on, there seems to be a lot of female leadership, right? So once again, interesting materials. Where do we go from here? Well, let's go to Japan briefly. Let's go to the Jabon culture. So the Jabon culture, oh, look at this. This is one of the longest cultures. It's from 14,500 BCE to 300 BCE. And you see these are some of the female images that kind of look like aliens, don't they? By the middle Jabon, between 2,500 BC to 4,500 BC, they made human representations out of fire clay called dogu, which are formed in fantastic and creative shapes with exaggeration of the female form in some cases. Again, possibly in connection to fertility. Let's go to the next image so you have a better look at that. So there you go, although it's very different there. So then what happens is something huge. Let's go to the next image. It's called the Great Shift. The Great Shift, set between 13,000 to 10,000 BCE, the last ice age was ending. And with the ice retreating northward, the ocean level rose to 400 feet inundating much of the coastal areas where people would naturally settle. As a result, there was approximately 10 million square miles that was added to the coastal regions, often turning islands into peninsulas, creating land bridges to the continents. Meanwhile, the large animal herds that were so much part of the hunter culture of men migrated north as well. Before this time, those of the Upper Paleolithic depended primarily upon meat as one of the most important food sources, as accumulated animal bones discovered at their campsites reveal, along with evidence gained from, well, accumulated stool samples discovered at these sites, which demonstrates a high yield of protein-based elements through mitochondria DNA analysis. With the preserved parasites in relation to meat consumption quite evident, while fiber is present, in what is often called paleo poop, in areas about Southern Europe and Central Asia, meat intake is unusually high. Men, in turn, who are primary suppliers of food through their hunting abilities, were greatly esteemed to a certain extent. As a result, you had a hunter cult with much prominence. Meanwhile, of course, women oftentimes were shown from the material culture to be involved in hunting in gathering pursuits, as hunting and gathering societies still do as late as 2024. But when the food sources of slower moving animals, such as reindeer and mammoth, retreated north with the retreat of the last ice age, beginning around 13,000 BCE, and when they were replaced by swifter stags and gazelles, meat was not as easy to come by. And so more food from vegetative matter became vital for survival, which in turn, by the way, greatly enhanced those who are involved in the gathering. And it was the women who were gathering. They became now the main food suppliers. Okay, so once again, we can prove this through stool samples, and we can see that in their poop, there's less meat and more plant going on. It's getting less and less, and we're seeing also less and less in the way of animal bones. I'm telling you, this is something that we can quantify, we can qualify, we can study from a strictly boring forensic perspective. Of course, all this focused energy on gathering, enhanced plant knowledge, even when it comes to medicinals, and would lead to the discovery of agriculture. As the main gatherers at first, women had grown accustomed to the life cycles of plants, learning how the environment affected their growth patterns. And as a result, many say that the discovery of agriculture actually came as a result of women. Now, the already significant mother goddess images, long associated with fertility, became even more important, as we can see. Let's see my face for a few moments. And so we find a plethora of female fertility images in Neolithic Europe and in the Middle East. So many, in fact, that the entire storerooms are actually full of them. Thousands upon thousands. At the same time, women were now buried. We know, because we have more material culture, more stuff that they have. People are collecting more stuff. We see that women are buried with dignity, as revealed in the placement of female skeletal remains. And so we're seeing that women are having more significance. Some of the hunters, however, didn't want to change. So here is the scenario. Got it. I'm going to give it to you right now. I'm going to drink a water. I'm going to tell you how it works. So what happens is you have these big old, if you catch a mammoth, you got food for a long time. If you catch a giant reindeer, you got food for a long time. These are not very fast moving. They're slow. They're easier to gain. So the men go out, and probably some women too, right? They go hunt. They bring back the animal.
I have a working theory that women that were not in the process of menstruation, that were not pregnant, my belief, and you see this in some hunter gathering society, is that the women join them. But that's just me. So I'll just throw that one for fun. Okay. So what happens is they go out and they bring the animals in. Now, what happens though is that these animals go away. So they're left with a gazelle. Are gazelles fast? Yeah. They're going to be chasing this thing. Rabbits, smaller meat, deer. And so, as opposed to bringing home food that's going to last a long time, they're going, hey, we're not bringing back much. And we see from the material culture that their fecal matter is having less and less meat. But we're also realizing there's less and less people. Oh no. Yeah, yeah. So they're starting to, well, starve. They need to have meat, so they have to change their ways. They have to, something's wrong with humanity. It takes us forever to change our ways. Did you guys know that for us to move from hunting gathering to an agricultural society, you know how long it took us to finally figure out? 4,000 years. That shows how we are. We have to go through these phases of, well, we're sort of figuring things out. So what will happen is they go out and they're figuring out the plants and the cycles there. Eventually, they figure out how to bring those plants a little closer. And then eventually they'll figure out how to grow it themselves. It's a long process, 4,000 years. So they are determined to have meat. This is the way things always work. Now, of course, granted, their lifespan is so short too. It's kind of like the story. It's kind of like, hey, I think we should, and then they die, and they're dying at 15 to 20 years of age, and so the kid is not going to have much time to learn too much because mom and dad are already gone or the collective unit's already gone. And so the level of the transmission of information is shortened. Does that make sense? So we're not developing that much because we're not living that long. So did you guys know? Here's a little fun fact you didn't know. Did you guys know that the first animal we tried to domesticate was the gazelle? You know what? We can watch. It's a sad story. We try 11,000 BCE, 10,000 BCE, 9,000 BCE, 8,000 BCE. It also took us 4,000 years to figure out the gazelle is not going to work out for us. So it's sad because, like in the Natufian culture, we see them and they're making these pens and they're making the walls a little higher, and they find little gazelle bones because apparently they're just jumping over. Once again, it's kind of like, hey, you know what? I think the gazelle is not going to. And the next guy does it. Hey, you know what? I think the gazelle is not going to. And so it goes on for 4,000 years. So that's our growing scale. Well, there's a group of individuals who just they don't want to change. They ate meat from the beginning. They're going to eat meat now. And so while everybody's learning to adapt for 4,000 years, a group of them decided what we're going to do. We're going to follow the mammoth and the reindeer north because, hey, that's the way things are. What does this have to do with patriarchy, matriarchy, everything? It does? Yeah. So here we go. So what happens is remember the egalitarian society, you got women, a large portion of them are the gatherers, men, a large portion of them are hunters. Yes, there are many exceptions to the rules. I recognize it. And there are certain societies that change that. Well, I'm talking about generality. Okay. So what happens is they have to adapt now eventually to more plant life and eating, less meat. Well, women have a role here. As they move north, a group goes north and they follow the they're called the mammoth hunters. They follow the mammoth, the big game, north into the colder regions, and the ice sheets are obviously melting further and further north. And so they're not wanting to change. They're going to be eating just meat all the time because you know what? We will never run out of a mammoth. It's an unlimited resource, right? So I'm serious. These mammoth hunters are crazy. They make their homes out of mammoth bones. They wear the mammoth wool for clothing. They make their weapons out of mammoth bones as well. And what do they eat? Mammoth day in, day out. This is never going to end. Women, on the other hand, as you move further north, you do realize that this soil had been under ice. And so that means there's less in the way of nutrients in the soil. And because of that, plants are not as diverse as they should be, which of course will minimize the vegetative gathering aspect. And so women more and more found themselves in a very interesting situation. You're going to see a change in their roles as you go north. Now, this is not the rule when it comes to, like, for example, the Vikings and certain other groups, but we're just simply going on archaeology from this time. Got it? So we'll have more diversity as time goes on. But at this time, this is the way things are. Then what happens is a surprise. The mammoth, you'll never believe this, it becomes extinct. Yeah. And as this resource gets less and less, people, they start to fight amongst each other over this dwindling resource. You can see what's happening. And so these, in large part, men will then become more warrior-like because they're fighting each other over all of these limited resources in the way of meat and even arable land. Is that making sense? They're fighting. Haven't you noticed when you study history that you have lots of very strong warrior type groups in the north? Oh yeah, give me one example. Huns. Okay, it's okay. Give me another example. Vikings. Okay, all right. Give me another. Mongols. Okay, stop. Okay, I get your point. Does that make sense? Is this helpful? Is it? Yeah. So you have these, and what turns out, we take a look at the graves, and we find the grave sites of men more decorated than that of women. Now we're going to forensics. Got it? We're seeing that male graves are more heightened. Do you have goddess figurines or these images of people? Yes, you do. But guess what? They become less and less. And we see increasingly in the material culture in those areas more male figurines and more hunting figurines. Is this making sense? So you're saying, well, okay, so the grave goods looks like women. Did you know in some cases, when some of these groups go to East Asia, the men are being buried very well and the women are disarticulated bones? You guys know that, right? They just kind of throw them in a pile. Of course, maybe you could say it's a special happy ritual that they're so esteemed that they're become one. I doubt that, right? So you see in the way the grave goods are, the way they're buried, you do have evidence in the north that there is this kind of culture going on. Is that making sense? You guys got that? And we also see that there are more warrior-like. Now, I mentioned the fact, were there warriors before in Europe further south? And the answer is absolutely. It wasn't a peaceful time. No, people fought each other. But to say that it was like it was later on is just not true. It is a stretch of the truth. Are you guys getting this? So what happens is this group of people, they're all fighting up north. Okay. A group of them, quite a few of them, go back down south. A group of them, a group of them go down to a place called the Caucasus Mountains. These groups of people who refuse to change, they're very obstinate, they're warrior-like, they are, meat-driven, women not doing too well, building walls and so forth, and they end up in the Caucasus Mountains, and they're called Indo-Europeans. Now you're getting my point. And you're getting Gimbutas' point too. This group then, around 5000 BCE, a little earlier, they decide to dispatch everywhere. So one group goes south towards Anatolia. They become the Hittites and the Luvians. Another group crosses over into Persia. They become Persians. Persians are Indo-Europeans. Another group goes across through the Khyber Pass into the Punjab, and they become Northern Indians. Another group goes to the west, and they dip down, and they become the Mycenaeans. Another group goes across Southern Europe, and they become the Latins. They become the Italians. They become the Spanish. They become the Portuguese. They become the Romanians. Another group crosses over, and they cross over. They become the Celts into the Isles. Another group goes north, and they become the Germanic peoples. Is that making sense? So what will happen is that they will cross these areas, and as they cross these areas, the material culture will change. As they cross these areas, you're going to see the way people are buried change. So as they move, we can actually trace every 100 years, even less, sometimes 50 years, where the migration is. And we can immediately see a change in the way the villages are. We can see the change of the pottery. We can see the change in how what they make, what they fashion, the artwork. We see a change also in the burial patterns, and it does seem to be evidential of a stronger sense of patriarchy. It does seem to be more warrior-like. Is that making sense? So we do have that. So yeah, does that help? Do you like my little mini lecture? Was that helpful? Kind of getting the bigger picture? Maybe, maybe not. I don't know. Okay. So this is the result of the Great Shift. There was also a interesting hiccup on the Great Shift where things changed and then it kind of went back the other. I'll just bring this up real quick. Let's go to the next image. That's a young Dryas period of time. So what happens with the young Dryas? Excuse me here. Young Dryas period is that there was a hiccup. James Kennett, professor emeritus at the Department of Earth Sciences at the University of California, Santa Barbara, realized that that looks like the Earth was getting looked like it was getting warmer, and then all of a sudden something happened, and what happened is that apparently a comet collided with the Earth. The international research team from 21 universities in 6 countries has identified a distribution of nanodiamonds of extraterrestrial nature at 32 sites in 11 countries, spanning an area of 50 million square kilometers across the Northern Hemisphere. This evidence is found within plain sight, for these elements are found within thick carbon-rich layers and is often visible as a thin black line a few meters below the surface. So the reality is that you dig down in the dirt here in Fullerton, you're going to come across it. Of course, Santa Barbara, right? He's not working there. So there is this. What happens is that changes everything. And as a result of that, it's going to get, as you can see here, not very nice to live. Many animals go extinct. And as a result of that, of course, we lose a few animals like the camel here in America, right? No more, and the horse here too. And so it's interesting because we see human development, and it looks like they're moving more and more toward plant life. It looks like they're moving more toward a settled life. And all of a sudden, the earth changes, the environment changes, and they have to retread. And many of these groups are becoming more settled, suddenly go back to a hunting, gathering society again. There's a reversal. And so it really tells you how much we are tied to our environment. Oh boy, this is going to go so exciting. Next part, Natufians. How do I say that so excited? But we're going to Natufians next. So next image. Yeah, there's young Dryas. Sorry, there's more young Dryas. All you want to know about the young Dryas period. This is a young Dryas for kids. What do you think, huh? All right. Next image. I like that image. There's the Natufians. Yeah. Between 13,000 to, well, they say 9, I say 8,000 BC. There's a group of people known as the Natufians. They cover much of the Levant,
as you know, so including places like Jericho and Palestine. They include our areas of Syria too. The Natufians are the ones to first cultivate the fig, by the way. Yummy, yummy, right? Some people say Gobekli Tepe is connected to the Natufians. The Natufians, we do know, here we go, more evidence. The Natufians had an egalitarian culture. We do know that. That is a absolute 100% fact. Male and female were equal. We have too much archaeology to prove it. And they retained their egalitarian culture that they inherited from their hunting gathering period of time. And that continued even when they started working toward more, not quite agriculture, but getting toward agriculture. You can see that they still retain this idea. They venerated various supernatural female forms. And we do know that it is connected to the fertility of the earth. We're getting to a period of time where we have enough evidence to make these associations and then possibly then read it back into an earlier period of time. But I'd say around 13,000 BC. That's not too bad, right? We do know they were affected by the young Dryas, where it looked like they had established villages and things were happening. And then all of a sudden, well, they're off hunting and gathering and wandering around again. Let's go to the next image. Following the young Dryas, many of the Natufians returned to village life. One of the first settlements happened to be in Jericho, located what is today Palestine. Jericho thrived and became a trade center. And by 9,600 BC, became one of the earliest known cities, having already 70 mud brick houses built on stone foundations. That was the home for about 1,000 people. The city covered about 9 acres at one point, having walls 6 meters deep and a well-constructed round tower. Let's go to see that tower. Next image. Okay. And this tower is about 8.5 meters in diameter, a solid stone core. The importance of this Tower of Jericho is that it is one of the earliest examples of stone architecture. Although we do have some earlier sites, it still is, when it comes to the way it's put together, this is one of the first constructions. I should have used my picture because it's a lot larger, because I've actually visited this site. So what is it? Military historians say it's for strategic reasons. Religious historians say it has to do with a religious high place. The answer is we don't know. What we do know, however, is that this city was able to utilize or organize a labor force that would be able to construct such a tower, which shows some kind of a political association. Let's go to the next image. You also have what's called a skull cult, which became even more widespread during the pre-pottery Neolithic, ranging from, so basically, according to custom, when a family member dies, the head is cut off, the jaw is removed, the flesh is cleaned off of the skull through exposure, and then the skull is filled completely with clay. Next, the outside of the skull is painted a flesh color with seashells placed in the eye sockets, and then put on a small pedestal of red clay directly on the floor of the family dwelling. As for the body, it was buried under the floor of the house. When the next family member died, the procedure repeated, like changing tires, rotating tires, while the skull of the previous family member was subsequently buried under the floor. So you've heard the term skeletons in the closet. For the Natufians, the skeletons were actually under the floors. The possibility that this was some kind of ancestor cult is often acknowledged and reveals that those who are recently deceased were believed to have the power of protecting the household, a power literally, well, seeing within the bones. Let's go to the next image. Another curiosity about the Natufians is they discovered long limestone mortars that were pierced directly through, with the upper part of the surface and the lower part directly against the corpse. Hence, there was a direct conduit, a channel between the worlds of life above and the world of death below. So they call them pipe mortars. Speaking of mortars, also there are pestles that are, so they will say, phallic in form. and and the deeply cut mortars are sometimes interpreted as representing female ideas. I'm not sure if I see this or not. Let's leave that up to your own imagination. But there you have it. We have also found that the Natufians buried their loved ones with lines of flowers. But let's go to the next image. A drink of water here. Oh. So what is this? So what this is the grave of what is often called the Natufian priestess or a shaman. It was discovered at Hilazon, Hashtet in Israel. She was a lady of high status who died when she was approximately 45 years old, quite old, again, for around 11 to 10,000 BCE. Approximately 5 foot tall, this lady was surrounded by exactly 50 tortoise shells that were carefully arranged to signify some meaning, along with parts of various animals, eagles, pigs, and leopards. One odd find with her was a human foot. Once again, what we're seeing here, we do see various grave goods are distributed amongst both males and females. We see that equally. We see within the graves a sense of equal status. We see here, however, this lady seems to be of a higher status. Let's go to the next image. Probably the most famous of Natufian images is the Ain Sakri lovers, the very first depiction of a male and female making love. These two lovers were carved out of a single stone and are directly facing one another, their legs intertwined, and in one case, with one holding the other's face. This is a love embrace of equals, not one in domination of the other. Yet when these figures are looked at from, let's go to the next image, looked at from behind on either side, as opposed to by side, the images are phallic symbols. Conversely, when the image is looked up from below, it depicts the vaginal region, and when above, it seems to depict breasts. So that's a very clever piece in general. Let's go to the next image. Another society that seems is Göbekli Tepe. Of course, this goes back to 10,000 to 9,000 BCE, located 6 miles from Urfa in eastern Turkey. This is a 22-acre site. It is distinguished by a circular row of stones that intentionally face inward, pointing to what resides at the center of the ring, a series of limestone T-shaped pillars, most rising as high as 3 meters or 10 feet high, but one towering as far as 18 feet high and weighing about 16 tons. There seems to be some kind of a ritual here. It is a circle. Few humanoid forms have surfaced from Göbekli Tepe, but there is let's go to the next image. So you can see a reconstruction of it here. But there is a relief, next one, of a naked woman posed frontally in a crouched position. It seems to be a sexual scene. Some people say that there are a phallus or two phalli below, or it could be, as suggested, could be maybe feet of somebody, of a baby coming out in a way that should not happen. So there are other curious things about this site as well. Of course, you see a lot of phallic symbols. Let's go to the next image. And that doesn't, I think that makes the point right there pretty quickly. There's another site called Göbekli Tepe. Let's go to the next image. And here you have some other interesting forms. Let's go to the next image, which is nearby. It dates roughly to the same period of time, around 9,000 BCE. The site is known for the earliest full-size human image made out of limestone. There are smaller clay figurines of humans about 5 centimeters high, most likely used as votive offerings. Female figurines, let's go to the next image, are usually depicted as sitting down, while the male figures are shown as standing up. In number, 179 male figures were found at Novelli Quarry.
few of them retaining their head. While most wear a sash or have a belt of some kind, their phalli are always showing, but curiously, not very pronounced. There are three types of female figurines. The first is that of a woman holding a child, usually with the baby shown just below the breast. And of course, obviously, this would be definitely a fertility figurine because you had a baby depicted here. And of course, and only two were found in the belly torpede, but we find this elsewhere. The second type is that of pregnant women with a very large protruding belly, with 6 found here. Finally, a third are that of a seated female, with 159 found of that site of seated females. Uh, while these seated women and even girls are shown with wide hips, they're otherwise slim and are naked. So, what does this mean? What is going on here? So, you're seeing some major changes. We're also seeing this a lot in the iconography, and that is before, while we didn't have a lot of clues, I guess we can see me now. Before we didn't have a lot of clues. Thank you, Margie, so much of what some of these purposes are. Now we're seeing more exteriorized artistic representations that clear up some of the doubt. Are they pregnant? Yes. Now they're holding the baby. So they had the baby, and you can see that it could mean that they're wanting a successful birth, which again was problematic. But what about the seated female figurine, which we see everywhere? A lot of anthropologists, archaeologists fight over this idea of these seated females. But I will just say one quick thing, and then I'll run away on that one. Okay. Okay, so childbirth today, when you give birth, typically you're in a horizontal position. In ancient times, they had something called a birthing chair. The idea is when you're seated, gravity makes that baby come out a lot easier. They did this in ancient times all the time. In fact, even this idea you're going to see in Buddhist stories. By the way, you're going to see Buddha's mom, and she's going to be leaning up against a tree to have her baby. According to even the Muslim idea of Jesus, with Isa is born of Miriam, of Mary, and she's leaning up against a palm tree. So we're going to even see this in Buddhist as well as Muslim traditions. This is just simply the way people are born. So maybe many of these images represent the idea of childbirth. It's just not the conventional way that we are used to. Is that making sense? So that's the possibility. Okay. So let's go to the next image. So now we move. So the Paleolithic age is ending. The Neolithic age is starting. And so we're seeing that happening gradually. Domestication of animals will also start to occur. And as a result of that, human society will continue to change. And so will the role of male and female within these societies. This is the period of time where I like to call the starchy food agricultural story. Basically, what happens is agriculture starts in what is today Eastern Turkey and Syria and Iraq around 9000 BCE, and they cultivated wheat and barley. And then eventually around 8500 BCE, this cultivation of wheat and barley reaches the Levant, and then eventually will reach going to India and Ethiopia in the south and Ireland and so forth, and Spain around 5000 BCE. In Africa, we will have the cultivation of course, sorghum was grown around there, as well as yams and okra and so forth between 8000 to 6000 BCE. Around the Yangtze River, on the Yellow River, around 6500 BCE, you're going to have rice, right, and soybeans. And in Southeast Asia, around 4000, 3000 BCE, you're going to have the taro root and yams.
Of course, you have bananas, breadfruit, oranges, tangerines, yummy, yummy, yummy. Let's move to the next image. Of course, in Mesoamerica, you have the cultivation of maize, and you're going to have what's called the three sisters. And so what's going to happen is they grow basically beans, squash, and tomatoes and peppers together. So what will happen, they create a symbiotic relationship. The idea was to create this relationship between corn, specifically beans and squash, with beans using the corn stalks as a growing trellis, with the nitrogen of the beans making for better corn. Meanwhile, the coarse and hairy squash was planted around the corn stalks and beans to form some kind of protection from the sun and to ward off animals. Of course, obviously, tomatoes will come about. Then what will happen is, next image, is that now that you have the advent of agriculture, now that that happens, now you have the result is people don't have to go from place to place. They don't have to do hunting and gathering. Now they can simply stay in one settlement and grow their food there. And of course, eventually you're going to have the domestication of animals, and they're brought in too. Of course, the gazelle didn't work out, and so they went from the gazelle, to the goat. But the goat didn't work out. The goat domestication, it lasts about 500 years. And then they figure out this is a bad deal, because the goats, what they used to do is they used to eat goats, what they do is they pull the grass out by the roots. And then as a result of that, that means that when it rained, it poured out the whole topsoil and it washed away so much. Did you know there's goat damage that's still throughout the Middle East today from this domestication of goats, because they're pulling out all of the stuff, and the topsoil is washed away, and as a result, we got lots of desert. So they went from that to sheep, because sheep are great because they eat the top of the grass, and then they leave behind their fecal matter, so they fertilize as they go. And of course, eventually, we'll move on to cattle and of course piggies and so forth. Well, now that we're in one place, now there is a division of labor. Now there's stuff to fight about. Got it? So there's emergence of three craft industries that come about. So you're going to have obviously metallurgy, you're going to have pottery, and you're going to have textile industries that come about around 7,000 BCE. Yeah, we figure out to make pottery. Did you guys know there's no use for pottery if you're traveling around? If you're migrating back to back, place to place, there's no reason, because pottery breaks. Pottery is about being in one place. So now that you're one place, pottery does make sense. Pottery is the ancient idea of a box. And what they would do is they bury their box, their pottery, in the ground, put seeds or other things. And so now they can store things, right? They can store things for the winter. So you have the gaining of material as a result of the specialization of labor. Well, what does that mean? What that means is that people are going to settle in, and you're going to start seeing gradually changes in society when that happens, because now there's stuff to fight about. There's stuff to make war against. And in many cases, you will have males in positions as hunters or oftentimes warriors. And as warriors, they're having to protect these particular villages and towns and cities. And you can see where we're going with this, right? You can see how the changes are going to change, but it doesn't happen right away. Good news, not right away. Let's go to the next image. We do have the Paleogene culture, 7,000 to 5,000 BCE. This is, of course, in China. We find some of China's earliest pottery connected to that. We realize that typically men wore loincloths and tied their hair in top knots during this period of time. And once again, 7,000 to 5,000 BCE. Although early reports suggest that maybe it was a matriarchal society. We see this, for example, Roy Kartik writes about this in 1999. Others argue that it was a society in transition from a matriarchy to a patriarchy, says Jan Sun in 2004. Uh, but guess what? You know,
This is what drives me crazy. Here it goes again. If it's not a matriarchy, then it has to be a patriarchy. If it's not one thing, it's the other. And what happens is when Chinese scholars get involved in this process, they immediately assume it's a patriarchy.
so let's take a look. Why don't we let the dead speak for themselves? So the burial of their dead is in round pits, along with food and utensils. Females are found buried in the center of a grave, surrounded by fine pottery. Let's take a look at the next image. Surrounded by fine pottery and other possessions, suggesting that they are connected when it comes to household goods in a place of honor. Also, we see that the women's funerals were definitely more ceremonious compared to those of the men. And the son is typically buried in the same location with his mother. Looking at this, does that make sense? Looking at this, I'm sorry. It looks to me like maybe not a matriarchy, but absolutely egalitarian, right? It looks like these women are definitely buried in a position of honor. And look, you're seeing it with your own eyes right here. Is that helpful? Right? Okay. Let's go to the next society. This is fun. Let's go to Pakistan, India, right? You have the Mehrgarh Society, 7,000 to 2,500 BCE. Some of the earliest ceramic figurines discovered in South Asia arrived from this civilization. These figurines were first simple, but eventually they appeared to depict only females. Did you hear that? Only females. By 4,000 BCE, these female figurines gained both prominent breasts and very elaborate hairstyles. It kind of looks like Princess Leia buns, or is that just me? I don't know. Do you see it? Right? Let's go to the next image. Also, the elaborate plating reveals a culture where hair ornaments was a priority and may have had some kind of ritual significance. Let's go to the next image. Some of these female figurines are portrayed as holding babies, and so are often viewed as mother goddesses. The prominence of these breasts recollect later Minoan civilizations, right? And in fact, they are oftentimes enhanced. And we're seeing something that's happening throughout the ancient world. And that is now, you're seeing the breasts are now being lifted up. They're being pushed up, which is now becomes a significant aspect of iconography at this time from everywhere, from India all the way across to Europe. So something is happening. What that represents, we are not sure. As for burials, the amount of burial goods decreased at a period of time. While they became more limited to ornaments, more goods were left with burials of females than males. Red ochre was found on some of the bones, suggesting that the graves may have been painted on the inside before the body was laid in. So that's interesting. Let's go to the next image. So you're still seeing all these ideas. Let's move on to the Yarmoukyan culture. The Yarmoukyan culture is also most noted for its plethora of female figurines. Let's go to the next image. Yeah, and maybe the next one too. Nice closer up. Yeah, there we go. So basically, once again, what does this mean? Well, okay, we get something else. They seem to be fertility female figurines. They're made out of pottery or limestone river pebble, excuse me. Often their heads are elongated and pointed, with their eyes made to resemble, can you see it? Kernels of grain. One from Sharar Ugalan combines the symbolism shown seated with exaggerated hips, holding her breasts, and having kernel-shaped eyes, a very overt connection to fertility, both for human reproduction and the fertility of the fields. At Shar Hogalan, 130 of these Yarmouktian figurines were uncovered, with 50 more found at Munhata. The association of female figurines with fertility is obvious, both of the fertility of the fields as represented by the kernels of wheat upon the images, as well as with human fertility as revealed through the exaggerated female characteristics. Most scholars do agree with this. A few of the figurines are male, while male phallic symbols are even more frequent. We're starting to see this more often. One curiosity with our Yarmouktian culture were the androgynous figures. Those figurines, neither male nor female, you can see my face now, or in some cases both, having breasts as well as a male member. Some scholars have theorized this could indicate the existence of a theoretical third sex within Yarmouktian culture. Others say that the contrasting sexual characteristics upon the same image demonstrate the concept of a trickster character, ideas that go against the society norm to indicate wrong or taboo behaviors. Of course, a third alternative is that they represent male and female merged into one, expressing the moment of unity between gendered forms in nature. Let's go to the next image. Next image, of course, is Halab culture, 6,100 to 5,500 BCE. Again, this was an egalitarian culture with no notable difference in the roles of men and women. As for wealth, the society was not highly stratified, with more equal when it comes to distribution. As with much of the rest of the areas about the Mediterranean and ancient Near East, female figurines are everywhere to be found. These female statuettes were associated with various animals or animal spirits, possibly, including serpents and bulls and cows and ox and pigs and doves, as well as the symbol of the double X. Many of these female figurines are depicted again as seated or in a squat position, with their hands folded under or positioned under their breasts. Once again, I think that this has to do with childbirth. The fact that some conservative archaeologists say that they are child toys or pornographic, once again, we're dealing, unfortunately, this is Eastern Anatolia and Syria and Iraq. We're dealing with this conservative element archaeologists that really have a problem when it comes to discerning female imagery within the material culture. Enough said on that. Next image. You also have Çatalhöyük, which thrived from 6,500 to 3,500 BC. Was it an egalitarian culture? Well, for a long time, they said it was a matriarchy, but it seems more possibly an egalitarian culture, much like the Natufian, Yarmouktian, and Halal cultures, as well as everywhere else throughout the ancient Near East and the Mediterranean basin and India. Archaeologists have discovered numerous female figurines, much like the Venus of Waldorf at Çatalhöyük, characterized by the persistent style of huge breasts, large thighs and bellies, and so forth. One figure, next image, while having enlarged breasts and hips, is undeniably, they say now, a goddess, sitting on a throne that is flanked by two lions, the symbol of goddesses in Anatolia all the way to the Roman period. This is a real instance of, yeah, we got a goddess here. This imagery continues unbroken all the way to the Roman era and will be later associated with Kibali. So, hey, there we go. We can say something now. That's kind of a big moment. Yeah, drum roll, please, right? Okay, so next image. So we also have images of the slim women from Çatalhöyük. They're even more mysterious. While few are holding infants and wearing elaborate wigs and even jewelry, they're often given the face of, well, reptiles. As for male figurines, there are a few, but nothing approaching the amount of female figurines discovered at the site. So what are these? Why do they have lizard heads? It's like, oh, maybe these are the lizard people that we always talk about. Ooh, well, anyway, so of course, obviously, you do realize that lizards, like snakes, they do something. What do? They shed, and so it could be connected to renewal or life that continues on, or regeneration. So there you have that. So that's a possibility. So anyway, so moving right along, the next image. You also have Ubaid culture, 6,500 to 3,800 BCE. And again, we see here it's an egalitarian society, and all more of these interesting figurines. However, we do realize that increasingly, as Ubaid culture from 6,500 BC to 3,800 BC, as time goes on, there is more stratification. And here we go. And all of a sudden, slowly but surely, we see in the material culture, we see women and men are first buried equally. And then eventually, increasingly, men are buried with more prominence and women are not. You're seeing a change. There's a change going on in Ubaid culture. What is going on? What is going on is the fact that, well, it appears that the Indo-Europeans are starting to sweep across. They're starting to influence these various societies in the Middle East. And so what happened as they're moving across, remember we're talking, they're starting from the Caucasus Mountains, these Indo-Europeans. And I told you that they're moving down south to Anatolia, which is Turkey. And now they're moving eastward towards across Persia to India. Well, guess what? This is right next to this culture. And so what's happening is the patriarchy of the Indo-Europeans is now affecting and influencing the material culture within the Middle East. The Middle East used to be egalitarian, and now it's slowly but surely moving towards a patriarchy, and we can see that within that society. Let's go to the next image. And so there's more examples of that there. Good. Let's go to the next image. So meanwhile, in Eastern Europe, you have the Cisco culture.
That's all I've got.
Oh, that's all you got? Okay, that's
Yep.
fine. So what happens is, so you can put that down. We'll just see my face. That's pretty good, right? And at this point, between 6,800 to 6,500 BCE in Southeast Europe, there's still this veneration of feminine aspects connected to fertility. And we're going to see this also with the Vince culture. But then what's going to happen is we're going to see a change. And I want to focus on, and we're going to conclude with this, I want to focus in on Eastern Europe. Oh, it's right over. Eastern Europe. There we go. So we're back to Gimbutas. And the Indo-Europeans are arriving with the so-called Kurgan culture, and they encountered groups in the area of Southeast Europe, right? Eastern Europe. And what we see is not exactly the story of Gimbutas, but I like hearing this. At first, it appears that this culture, the Indo-Europeans, when they arrived, at first, there's this period of time where they seem to be side by side. They seem to have sites that are connected to the Indo-Europeans and sites that are connected to those who were there before. And they seem to get along. What's called the Sesklo culture to the arriving Domini culture connected to the Indo-Europeans. This lasts for a little while. Between 4,800 BCE, I don't want to give you exact dates here, to 4,400 BCE, it looks like
Can't we all just get along? And we're going to get along. Then suddenly it changed. There's new incursions also coming from the steppes, and they join in, and they don't want to accommodate the way the first wave did. And we start seeing a change. Then throughout Southeast Europe at this time, now we see within the material culture settlements being disturbed, with evidence that many of these villages were indeed burned down. Of course, you can always have other ways of interpreting this evidence, especially amongst those who insist all these transformations were indigenous and were not the result of an outside group coming from the Caucasus. But here's the problem, and it is a problem, because what happens is that what replaces those cultures is something different. The old patterns are changing. The skeletons now of those buried in these graves now that replace these earlier settlements, I'm sorry, forensics shows it, focus on males, often buried with their weapons and other items, revealing their prestige, and contrasted greatly with the burials of women who were not treated with any special treatment. We see it right there. There is archaeological truth then when Gimbutas declares about the material finds from this period as, quote, weapons, 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 she says. It's just incredible how many thousands of pounds of these daggers and swords were found from the Bronze Age. This was a cruel period and the beginning of what it is today. You turn on the television and it's war, 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 whatever channel, unquote. She's right. But the point is, you look at the material culture and they are into weapons. There's a whole bunch of it. I mean, there's this focus in on war. Were there weapons before at these sites? The answer is yes. Were some of these cultures before these Indo-Europeans arrived, were they had warlike aspects? The answer is yes, but not absolutely to the degree. And so now we're seeing that those who oppose Gimbutas are exaggerating their half of the story. See, they're saying, oh, well, we had this before. Yeah, but you're not telling the whole truth. You didn't have that much before. Got it? It's now, this is like over the above too much. Oh, but we had evidence of males in certain areas buried with dignity beforehand, and some evidence of women not so much. Yeah, you have that. But as a rule, most of the time, it was equal, or you saw the women a little bit more. That's just plain boring forensics without having any agenda at all. And while female images and symbols continue for a while in prominence, they are now accompanied, we see in the material culture, by more and more male images. And at time, these male images become more prominent. And in some cases, we see less female images and more male ones. What does that represent? There's a changing ideal going on. Gimbutas and other archaeologists have often painted the picture of an old Europe that was peaceful and egalitarian and even matriarchal, that was suddenly invaded and replaced by a warrior-based patriarchal Indo-Europeans. And then, of course, evidentially, warriors and conflicts did exist before 4,400 BC, if that's true. But at the same time, we do realize that there is an actual change. One other thing that kind of drives me crazy is you're also going to see these female figurines, and they're suddenly wearing clothing, and they're being covered up. Huh. I wonder what's going on here. Is this helpful? So there is evidence for that, right? Is this helpful? So what does this mean? I'd like to conclude. Take a big sip here. I want to tell you this. What does this mean? This means that basically the takeaway from this is that the earliest societies were egalitarian. Whether you take a look at modern hunting gathering societies, or you look into the material culture, or you just use plain common sense, it's egalitarian. But things do change when we get to the time of the Great Shift. At that time,
you have a settled population that stays there. They have to adjust to agriculture, and there's going to be changes there because as a result of that, they don't have to be hunting gathering anymore. They're settled in villages, towns, and cities. But also the Indo-Europeans do make a difference. These Indo-Europeans, those mammoth hunters that went to the north, when they came back, they really did bring patriarchy in a strong way with them. We take a look and we realize that a large portion of the gods from the north are just that. They're gods. And since you're moving all the time, they focus more on solar deities, and with the earth deities, not as important. They do have them, but they're not as emphasized. They're less connected to the earth. They're more connected to chasing the hunt, right? And of course, eventually they go from hunting gathering to pastoralists, and that's the form the Kurgan people are when they go into this area of Europe. But it's interesting because I want to go somewhere else, and that is, did you guys know that Persia used to be egalitarian? But as soon as the Indo-Europeans arrive, we see in the material culture, which I just talked about, the Ube culture, we do it with Assyria, but it goes obviously connects the cultures into Persia. What will happen is we'll see a change also, and it moves into a patriarchy. Then all of a sudden, you guys got to understand that the Mundas and the Dravidians in India, they were an egalitarian society. You know, the Mohenjo-Daro Harappan civilization, looking at the archaeological evidence, they're egalitarian society. And then the Indo-Europeans arrived. Who are they? They're called the Aryans, right? They're Indo-Europeans. They come through the Khyber Pass. They go into the Punjab region today, and they bring with it a patriarchal system. And of course, the gods that are depicted in the Vedas, which are connected to, of course, the Indo-Europeans, a large portion of them are male deities. Sure, they have female deities like Ushas. Who's she? She's goddess of the dawn. That's it. Yeah. But for the most part, they are male deities. But then later on, when the indigenous Mundas and Dravidians mix with the of course, obviously the Indo-Europeans, that's when you get this, that's when you come to goddesses, because these goddesses were part of the indigenous cultures before the Indo-Europeans arrived, and they reasserted themselves. But that was during the time of the Upanishads. So we're looking at this change happening between 700 to 500 BCE. So you have this equilibrium created, but still India remained a patriarchy, right? So are you guys getting this? So we do see that the environment also directly affects these kinds of changes. We are unusually influenced by where we live and how we live, and how we understand that how to survival in general. And the point of the matter is that we can see that looking at the graves, looking at the artwork, looking at the settlement patterns, there definitely is a change, but we have to use more than one discipline. It is about, and this is the hardest part of this talk, it is about the convergence of evidence. It's like everybody has a piece of the pie, but nobody's willing to share it. So you have the anthropologists in one corner, and I'm sorry, they seem to be right. When it comes to looking at current pastoral as well as hunting gathering societies, because they are experts at human nature, are they not? And so it is important to understand that. It's also important to talk to the archaeologist. They're able to read that information. They're able to understand the material culture from where it comes from. We also have to understand the historian and the historical methodologies and how these ideas all fit together. But we need the religious scholar too, because the religious scholar will look into and understand and add on to what the anthropologist says when it comes to value judgments and ideas and perceptions of religion that we do see in later examples. If we take what we see from 10,000 BCE and we mirror it back, we have a stronger idea of where these ideas come from.
In many ways, it does seem to support what happened after 10,000 BCE. And you see, in a sense, you gain a greater sense of context. And one more note: humans don't want to change. So the best plan is choose the most boring answer possible, and also realize that we don't want to be flexible. It took us 4,000 years to figure out agriculture. Um, and so that means is that the more conservative estimation sometimes is the better one. It doesn't mean that I'm going to change my perception, but I'm saying we still have to be careful when it comes to examining these kinds of situations. And you got to realize that the most important aspect for these people is simply one thing: survival. They want to live, and they're not sitting there, in an office or in a classroom, uh, you know, you know, pontificating about these ideas. They're worried about where their next meal is going to be coming from. They're worried about, if they're going to have enough shelter from the heat or from the various elements. And so for them, they're not thinking, should I choose a guy or a gal for this kind of idea? They're thinking, I'm going to use whatever I have at my disposal, whatever resources I have, just to see the next day. Who cares about, female, masculine? It's just all about continuing on with life, keeping this thing going. They're not thinking deeply about these kinds of things. And that's why sometimes the most simple explanation is the best. With that said, one more thing. As for Gimbutas and the others, it's somewhere in between. It was an idealistic society by any case before 4,400 BC. No way. It wasn't the matriarchy, but it wasn't a patriarchy either. It wasn't with men in charge. It was absolutely an egalitarian society. But things change. And I want to say one more thing. Please, give me one more moment here. When you hear this particular lesson, I want you to think to yourself, why is this important? Why is it important to tell your son and daughter that patriarchy is an artificial construction? Why is that important? That it didn't exist at a certain point and then it came about. It's not true that men always did this, were leaders, and women were always in this other kind of position. What do you think that knowledge will do? I think that knowledge will be extremely liberating. I believe that knowledge will emancipate the mind in so many different ways. And to realize, if that is artificial, if patriarchy, even matriarchy, ultimately is egalitarian, maybe you can take those kinds of ideals and bring that to today. And so if somebody says, well, it's always been this way, traditionally men always did this, and you could say, no, that's not true. Or traditionally women always did this, you can say, no, it's not. Yes, true. Women were the ones who were part of obviously childbearing, right? But men contributed too. And we have evidence that men also were involved in child rearing activities, as some of the latest studies have talked about, right? But at the same time, just because they're doing separate kinds of jobs doesn't mean one is above the other too. Just because you're holding different roles, whether you're in the household or outside of the household, doesn't mean that one is better than the other, or one's greater than the other, or that one deserves more power than the other. Ultimately, when we take a look at these earlier stories, we really realize that women were leaders as much, if not a little bit more, in the Paleolithic age than men. And there's reasons for that. So let's have this talk be a kick in your complacency, to wake you up and to realize that let's just tear this patriarchy down. Thank you. Have a great night.